There are friendships forged in the heat of a television set that last a lifetime. And then there are the ones that quietly crumble, buried beneath years of forced smiles, unanswered phone calls, and politely edited interviews. The story of Gary Burghoff and the man who came to utterly despise him is one of Hollywood's most carefully guarded secrets. Not because it was too scandalous to tell, but because it was too human, too complicated, and too painful for anyone involved to reduce to a simple headline. For decades, fans of MASH looked at that ensemble cast and saw family. What they didn't see was the slow, grinding erosion happening just behind the camera, between two men whose talents were equal, whose egos occasionally clashed, and whose relationship ultimately collapsed under the weight of something far more ordinary than jealousy or ambition. It collapsed under exhaustion, misunderstanding, and the impossible pressure of being asked to be someone you're not, every single day, for years on end. To understand why someone came to hate Gary Burghoff, you first have to understand what Gary Burghoff represented. Not just on screen, but on set. Not just to audiences, but to the people who worked alongside him through some of the most grueling, emotionally demanding television production schedules in the history of the medium. Because the hatred, if we're being precise about the word, was never really about Gary the man. It was about what Gary's presence demanded of everyone around him. And that is a far more interesting story than any tabloid ever managed to tell. Before MASH became a cultural institution, before the teddy bear and the stammered sir became icons of American television, Gary Burghoff was simply a young actor from Bristol, Connecticut, trying to make something lasting out of his talent. He had trained seriously, worked regional theater circuits, played jazz drums with genuine skill, and carried himself with the kind of quiet intensity that serious performers recognize in one another. When Robert Altman cast him in the 1970 film adaptation of MASH, Gary was 26 years old and relatively unknown outside theater circles. The role was small, a company clerk with wide eyes and an uncanny ability to hear incoming helicopters, but Gary transformed it into something unforgettable. Altman's film was chaotic by design, a sprawling anti-war satire built on overlapping dialogue, dark irony, and a cast of enormous personalities. Within that noise, Gary found a frequency all his own. Radar O'Reilly became the film's emotional anchor, the one character who reminded audiences that beneath the absurdity and the gore, there were actual human beings trying to survive something terrible. It was a masterful piece of instinctive acting, and it left a deep impression on everyone who saw the film, including the producers at CBS who were tasked, 2 years later, with turning that film into a weekly television series. When those producers went looking for continuity between the film and the new show, Gary was the only cast member they invited back. It was an enormous vote of confidence, and it placed him in an unusual position from the very first day of production on the television series. He was, in a very real sense, the living link between the original vision and the new one. He carried Altman's DNA into a CBS soundstage, and that gave him an authority, unspoken but unmistakable, that some of his newer castmates would come to find deeply uncomfortable. The television version of MASH premiered on September 17, 1972, and within 2 seasons it had become one of the most watched and critically admired programs in America. Gary's radar was central to that success. The character's boyish mannerisms, his nervous energy, his moments of unexpected emotional depth. Audiences responded to all of it with extraordinary warmth. Fan mail arrived by the thousands. Critics used phrases like the soul of the show. Network executives pointed to Radar as proof that MASH was more than comedy. Gary had, in the most literal sense, made himself indispensable. And indispensability, on a collaborative television set where every actor is fighting for space and meaning, is a complicated thing to be. Wayne Rogers arrived on the MASH set as trapper John McIntyre with a very specific idea of who he was as a performer. He was precise, controlled, professional in the most disciplined sense of the word. He hit marks. He delivered lines. He understood the machinery of television production, the schedules, the budgets, the unspoken agreements that keep a large ensemble functioning without chaos. Rogers was, by every account, a consummate professional, and he took genuine pride in that identity. Gary Burghoff operated differently. Where Rogers was mechanical precision, Gary was emotional archaeology. He dug into scenes looking for truth rather than efficiency. He questioned dialogue when it didn't feel right. He requested additional takes when he sensed that a moment hadn't fully breathed. He was, in the language of acting theory, deeply process-oriented, and on a production schedule that regularly demanded 14-hour shooting days with scripts that needed to be turned around on tight deadlines. That process could grind everything to a halt. In the early seasons, Rogers tolerated Gary's approach with something resembling respect. The results, after all, were undeniable. Whatever Gary's method cost in time, it tended to produce moments of genuine feeling that elevated the entire episode. But tolerance is a finite resource, especially under sustained pressure. As the seasons progressed and the production demands intensified, Rogers' patience began to thin. The delays became less acceptable. The questions Gary raised about dialogue began to feel less like artistic instinct and more like willful disruption. According to accounts later referenced in published biographies and retrospectives on the show's production history, things eventually came to a head in a way that shocked the entire crew. During one particularly tense afternoon of rewrites, an afternoon during which Gary once again pushed back on dialogue he felt was false, Rogers reportedly reached a breaking point. What followed was an eruption of frustration that sent a physical shockwave through the set and made clear, in unmistakable terms, that something had broken between them. The professionalism that followed the next morning was real, but it was the professionalism of colleagues rather than collaborators. The warmth was gone. A chill settled in its place and never fully lifted during Rogers' remaining time on the show. Rogers departed after season 3, citing contract disputes with the network and producers. That explanation was accurate as far as it went, but people who were present during that period of production understood that the interpersonal tensions, with producers, with creative decisions, and with cast members including Gary, had made continuing deeply unappealing. He was done. And though he never made Gary Burghoff the central villain of his departure story, the subtext was legible to anyone paying attention. What made the situation particularly painful was that neither man was wrong. Rogers was right that production efficiency matters, that a television set is not an acting class, and that holding up a crew of dozens to search for emotional truth in a single scene is a genuine imposition. Gary was right that authenticity is what separates forgettable television from something that lasts, and that Radar's power came precisely from the refusal to play him cheaply. Two valid perspectives, two incompatible working styles, and zero institutional support for finding common ground. That is a recipe for resentment, and resentment is exactly what they got. If Wayne Rogers represented the most dramatic expression of tension on the MASH set, Alan Alda represented something more subtle and, in many ways, more wounding. Alda was Gary's intellectual and creative equal, a performer of immense skill, a developing writer and director of genuine vision, and a man whose influence over the show's tone and direction grew with each passing season. By the time MASH entered its middle years, Alda was effectively the show's creative conscience, co-writing scripts, directing episodes, and shaping the philosophical direction of the series in ways that went far beyond his acting role. Gary both admired and resented this. He admired it because he recognized Alda's talent and understood that the show benefited from having such a strong creative force at its center. He resented it because Radar's character arc, or rather, the deliberate suppression of any character arc, felt increasingly like a creative sentence he had not agreed to serve. While Hawkeye Pierce evolved, deepened, and darkened over the course of 11 seasons, Radar remained frozen. He was required to stay boyish, innocent, and emotionally uncomplicated because that is what producers believed audiences needed from him and what the show's balance demanded. Every time Gary pushed for something more complex, a moment of real anger, a streak of moral ambiguity, a glimpse of the adult that Radar was clearly becoming, the pushback came swiftly. Alda's vetoes were not personal. He has said as much in the years since, and there is no reason to disbelieve him. From a narrative standpoint, Radar's innocence served a crucial structural function. Losing it would have destabilized something delicate in the show's emotional architecture. But Gary experienced those vetoes personally, because creative expression is personal, because his sense of professional worth was tied to his ability to grow within the role, and because watching everyone else's character deepen while yours is held in amber is a quiet, daily form of professional humiliation, even when it's done for artistically defensible reasons. The distance between them grew. Gary withdrew between takes, spending time alone sketching wildlife or working through drum patterns rather than socializing with the cast. Crew members noticed the change. The kid who had been universally beloved in the early seasons was now somehow apart from the group. Not hostile, not dramatic about it, just quietly elsewhere. Some interpreted this as arrogance. Others recognized it for what it was. A man managing his own pain in the only way available to him. McLean Stevenson, who played Colonel Henry Blake, was among the most honest about the complexity of working with Gary. He acknowledged friction without cruelty, describing a relationship that swung between genuine warmth and genuine irritation depending on the day. Gary's hypersensitivity, the very quality that made his performances so affecting, made him difficult to predict and sometimes difficult to comfort. Small misunderstandings could compound into real hurt feelings before anyone realized what had happened. Stevenson cared about Gary, but he also found him exhausting at times, and he was honest enough to say so. By 1979, Gary had made up his mind. 7 years into the series, with his marriage strained and his sense of self increasingly entangled with a character he could no longer fully inhabit, he told producers he was leaving. The negotiation that followed produced a compromise. He would stay long enough for a proper send-off. 2 episodes that would give Radar a meaningful goodbye and give audiences a chance to mourn a character they had loved across most of the decade. The episodes were written with genuine care and emotional intelligence. Radar would receive news of his uncle's death, return home to Iowa, and leave the camp quietly as the business of war continued without pausing to acknowledge his absence. The concept was perfect. The execution nearly wasn't. On set, Gary and the director Charles Dubin found themselves at fundamental odds over how Radar's exit should look and feel. Dubin envisioned restraint, a quiet departure, understated and therefore devastating in the way that truly earned grief tends to be.